We say culture is important, culture matters. Well, how?
We're powered by our brains. We're not always rational. We are influenced by others.
I think I'd start with looking at what's called the better than average effect.
So one of the things we look for picking flight directors is that what we call command presence, right? You kind of just look at people like, you better get it together. We got stuff to do, right?
Good practice would be for a leader to say, well, this is a mistake I made recently, and this is what I did about it.
I can't emphasize enough the disempowerment of the lonely decision maker.
So the opposite of what we think of as an ethical decision frame, we can think of as a game frame.
It doesn't make you unethical to wrestle with this. The smart money is we help you to try to figure this out.
This is Banknotes, Banking Culture Reform. The views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System.
Hi, and welcome to the Banking Culture Reform podcast, part of the New York Fed's initiative to drive awareness and change in financial services culture. This series, Norms, Mindsets, and Decision-Making, explores questions like, why do ethical people do unethical things? How can organizations encourage staff to speak up and executives to listen up? And what role does context play in shaping people's behavior? My name is Tony DiCario, and I'm a member of the New York Fed's culture team. Today, we'll hear from Taya Cohen. Taya is an associate professor of organizational behavior and theory at Carnegie Mellon's Tepper School of Business. Taya studies moral character in the workplace, including the predictive power of guilt proneness in individuals. In this episode, we'll learn why highly guilt-prone individuals may have a moral advantage. And Taya will share her perspective on individuals' proclivities towards ethical behavior and honesty, as well as how to hire for these traits. So welcome, Taya, and thanks for speaking with us today. I'd love to start by asking what motivated you to work on organizational behavior, and more specifically, why do you care and why should others?
Thank you. My original interest in studying organizational behavior came from my interest in psychology, of trying to understand why people behave the way they do. And through psychology, I became increasingly interested in how people behave at work, because we spend most of our lives at work, and how we behave at work has implications both for, how we and other people behave in the workplace, but also outside the workplace as well. So the field of organizational behavior studies people in organizations and takes insights from psychology, sociology, and related fields to try and understand human behavior, for the most part, while people are at work, or the implications being at work.
One of the things that you are known for is studying moral character, specifically moral character in the workplace. Could you please describe for us what you mean by moral character in the workplace? What is that?
So moral character is a person's disposition to think, feel, and behave in an ethical manner. There's a variety of different character traits that we can think of as moral character traits. I've organized this and thinking about it into personality traits that might be associated with the person's motivation to do good and avoid doing bad. So we can think of a moral motivation. We can also think of character traits that have to do with the person's moral ability, right? Their ability to do good and avoid doing bad. And then other moral character traits we can think of as related to identity. So does a person care about being a good person? Is morality central to how they see themselves? And so the term moral character, I use it broadly to refer to a variety of different character traits, all of which would relate to people thinking, feeling, and behaving ethically.
Specifically within your work on moral character, you look at the concept of guilt proneness. Can you describe a little bit how you think about guilt proneness, what it is?
So guilt proneness is a moral character trait that captures the extent to which a person would feel bad about their behavior if they did something wrong, even if no one knew about what had happened. So highly guilt-prone people, they feel bad. They feel guilty about mistakes, transgressions, and especially when those actions negatively impact others. With guilt proneness, I think of it as an aspect of a person's personality. So some people are more disposed than others to anticipate guilty feelings before they behave badly. And that helps them act more ethically, more responsibly, makes them more trustworthy. So people with high levels of this character trait, a guilt proneness, they feel this great sense of interpersonal responsibility. And that's helps them be better employees, better leaders, because they would feel bad for letting others down or for doing the wrong thing.
So is this something that's just innate in people, or can it be learned, guilt proneness?
I think it's a little bit of both. There's nature, there's nurture, there's some combination, but there does seem to be something stable, but not definitive or determinative, because it certainly changes. Guilt proneness in general for all of us increases over time as we get older. We mature. Right? As all of us mature, in general, our guilt proneness increases. But the guilt proneness may increase or even decrease at different rates for different people. Some people might be more predisposed from others from a young age, early in childhood, maybe even something that they're born with, although, we don't fully know. And then a person's experiences over the course of their life in childhood and adulthood shapes who they are. There's lots of debate about, to what extent is personality a result of, say, genetic or biological influences? How much of it is from the environment? What's the combination? I think some of the best research in this area probably says about maybe we can think about a third of the variance, the variability in who we are across a variety of personality traits. We might link to something more genetic or biological, something that maybe we're born with. But then there's another third that might be environmental. And then, of course, there's the remaining third might be some combination of the two. And those are very rough estimates. And so I think of guilt proneness much like how we'd think of other personality traits, with some nature, some nurture, and of course, the combination.
So Taya, how do you measure guilt proneness?
To measure guilt proneness, I found the most efficient way is to ask people a few questions. So my colleagues and I devised a 5-question scale we call the 5-item guilt proneness scale. And so we ask people to imagine different situations that they might find themselves in, and they read each one, and each situation describes how they might behave in the situation. And we ask them about the likelihood that they would feel bad about their behavior. Would you feel bad about what you did? Right? And to get at guilt proneness. So for example, one question: after realizing you've received too much change at a store, you decide to keep it because the sales clerk doesn't notice. What's the likelihood that you would feel uncomfortable about keeping the money? One third one that I like: at a coworker's housewarming party, you spill red wine on their new cream-colored carpet. You cover the stain with a chair so that nobody notices your mess. What's the likelihood that you would feel that the way you acted was pathetic? What all these have in common is you've done something wrong. Nobody knows about what you did, but would you feel bad about it? And so we just ask people to imagine these kinds of situations. And it turns out that these questions about what you might think are a little strange kinds of situations, they predict real consequential behaviors. And because of that, it's kept me fascinated for so many years about how just asking people these questions can then predict their behavior, say 3 months later at their jobs. And so they do seem to tap into something about a person's character that is enduring. No one knows about what you did, but it's your own conscience. I think of guilt proneness as the strength of your conscience.
To what extent, in your experience, do you think kind of individual motivations drive misconduct or unethical behavior versus how much context and environment drives that unethical behavior? So in your opinion, would that follow kind of the same?
If we thought of, say, misconduct broadly, I know from my own work that I can ask people a few questions, say 5 self-report questions about guilt proneness, and that predicts their behavior, their workplace deviance, counterproductive behavior many months later, 3 months later over time. So there's something that we're capturing that's really about the individual. But at the same time, it's not 100% perfect prediction. And, people, who they are sort of affects how they interpret situations, and it affects what kinds of situations they enter into and experiences they have. It's really hard to kind of pit the person against the situation because people create the situations they're in. And so it's really a joint influence. When we think about it, it's hard to separate the two, because who a person is, how they interpret situations, how they treat others, then affects the situations that they're in. And so one example actually is a paper I have under review right now that I wrote with a former doctoral student. And what we found that the people who did more bad behaviors at work were subsequently, a week later, treated worse, had more mistreatment from their colleagues, and then experiencing more mistreatment led them to behave even worse, right? And so you get into this cycle where we know negative experiences, being mistreated, abusive supervision, ostracism, discrimination, all of these negative, stressful situations can cause people to behave badly. And yet we also know if people behave badly, then they are more likely to be treated more negatively by others. And then you get into these patterns where people create the situations that they are in to some extent, but of course not exclusively.
So it's just a vicious cycle.
This vicious cycle. And one thing that we found interesting related to moral character is people who had a reputation for being highly moral, and these are people who their coworkers identified as being relatively more moral than, say, their peers. When they behaved badly, they weren't mistreated as much in the future. So they were perhaps forgiven more. Whereas people who are lower in moral character, when they behaved badly, when they enacted counterproductive work behaviors, they were subsequently mistreated more by their coworkers. So again, this joint influences of the person and the situation and of people creating the situation makes it hard to sort of separate into one or the other.
I'm going to take a step back a little bit. What, in your opinion, makes otherwise ethical or moral people do immoral things or make unethical decisions?
Recently, I've been thinking a lot about what we call moral awareness or moral recognition. You can think of some people are more likely than others to have moral blind spots. Maybe all of us have some moral blind spots. And in certain situations, situational pressures or the way the situation is structured could cause us to have moral blind spots or not have low moral awareness or not much moral recognition. And so one thing that I found really interesting in my recent work is that people who have higher levels of moral character in general have greater moral awareness of the decisions they're faced with. They're more likely to recognize the moral implications. Other people might be in the same situation and they might see the decision as, something just a strategic decision or maybe a financial decision or a decision not particularly related to morality and ethical concerns. And so part of the answer, I think, to the question is, do people even recognize, what are the moral issues that could be at play here?
Many of our listeners are bankers who have an interest in having their staff make ethical decisions, make moral decisions, and have, therefore, increased moral awareness.
So I think it's not just about sort of what the person brings in and the lens they use, but how decisions are framed. I've been thinking lately about what's the opposite of moral recognition. And the idea that my colleague Eric Helzer of the Naval Postgraduate School and I have come up with is the idea of game framing. If you think of something as a game, there's two elements that might be related to having low moral awareness. So if you think of something as a game, often you can think of it as adversarial, right, with winners and losers and competitive. And so that could lead to a competitive motivation to achieve one's goals and beat opponents. And then the other aspect of a game frame is that in games, starting and endpoints, rules of play, scoring methods, all those could easily be different. And what's important here is that when it's a game, there's a sense of it's arbitrary, it's artificial, and the rules don't carry over outside the specific game. If you're a banker and you see banking as an adversarial context, right, with winners and losers, or the goal is to win, and how you behave in that setting doesn't say anything about who you are, right? It's just me playing the game. It doesn't say anything about my character, my values, or anything about me. That combination can lead to a lot of dishonesty. So some people, I think, may more naturally or by who they are, be more or less likely to apply a game frame, but also how, the workplace culture can amplify or attenuate that sort of framing of decisions. So if there is a workplace culture that frames things as, very competitive environment, adversarial, and it has a message that, how a person behaves here in this workplace doesn't say anything about who they are, about their true character, or that the standards in this setting are not real, or, they're more like temporary agreements than moral absolutes. So that mindset and that culture that's created could allow for a lot of dishonesty, unethical behavior. But conversely, if decisions and the culture in the workplace suggest that one more of cooperation or value creation, that is not this win-lose context, and perhaps most importantly, if saying, well, how I behave here, it is important. It does say something about who you are, right? It's not just a game that you're playing with no implications for anyone outside of this context.
Do you think there might be something about financial services that would lend itself more or less to this game framing or to potential unethical behavior?
I don't know if we could use a broad brush to think of all of financial services, but certainly elements of it seem like they could lend itself to this very win-lose mindset where being cooperative is seen as a liability. If the financial services industry and the work is structured that people become very detached from the implications of their behavior for other people or for themselves, if it's just numbers in a spreadsheet, it can be easy not to recognize the implications of that and the ethical implications. To the extent that the culture and the work removes people or makes it hard for people to see the implications of their decisions for themselves or others, where that could allow for a person to believe, well, what I'm doing here doesn't really say anything about who I am, that would be a potential problem for the industry.
Are you aware or familiar with any interventions to counter either that detachment from the outcome of your behaviors and your decisions, or to counter kind of the, I'm just a player in this game, this isn't me?
I think there's been work in a variety of different areas that suggest various kinds of reminders. So, early work in psychology, not necessarily even the domain of unethical behavior, but if putting mirrors up and making people kind of think of themselves, that can certainly have an impact. And I don't know if mirrors are the answers per se, but things that make people sort of see themselves and see their behavior as, how I'm behaving here does have implications for how I might see myself. And so interventions that make people kind of understand the consequences of their behavior for themselves or others. Earlier in my career, I studied intergroup conflict and competition and cooperation between groups. And one intervention that we found worked very well there, which I think could have relevance about ethical behavior as well, is considering the long-term implications, the consideration of future consequences, we call it. So if I do this now, how is that going to affect the subsequent decisions other people might make? What are the effects of that? A lot of unethical behavior comes about because when people are short-sighted, when they're focused narrowly on short-term gains, and especially if they're focused narrowly on themselves. So interventions that encourage people to think more expansively, both about the long term in addition to the short term, and about other people in addition to themselves. Those interventions may look different in different workplaces, right? And so there's the motivation to do good or avoid doing bad, but then there's also a person's capability. And so interventions that give people the information, the tools they need to behave more ethically, I think that can be effective as well. And there's a framework that Professor Mary Gentile at the University of Virginia has developed called Giving Voice to Values. And the idea behind that framework of ethical leadership is that a lot of people, most people, if we want to do the right thing, and they notice something. And so sometimes we don't notice. That's the moral awareness. But sometimes we do notice something that we're not comfortable with, but we don't speak up. Often we don't speak up because we don't feel prepared. We don't feel confident. You give people the tools, the information, the confidence to be able to voice their values, to speak up when they have concerns, to figure out how they can do that effectively. That can be a potential way to make people more willing to speak up when they do notice issues.
What might some of those tools be?
One thing I teach is negotiation. And in negotiation, we know people are more likely to lie when they don't feel prepared. And so simple tools like having a negotiation, like having a planning document where you identify things that you want to reveal, things that you don't. And so similarly, in this idea of, how can a person give voice to their values or speak up? Do you have a script? Have you identified what are the ways the audience may be more receptive so you don't make them feel threatened? And so there's not a sort of magic bullet or one particular thing you might say, but the idea is if you sit down, okay, what if I were to voice my values? What if I were to speak up when I noticed something I wasn't comfortable with? What are the implications of that? And what I have looked at in my work on honesty is that people believe having honest conversations will be much worse than they actually are when they have them. And so recognizing that and preparing for those conversations, figuring out what information you need and how the other side might be more receptive to it. That's the process that I think can be helpful.
Is the connection between guilt proneness and outcomes. So could you give a description of the work that you've done on linking high levels of guilt proneness to particular outcomes in terms of decision making?
When I originally started studying guilt proneness, it was to better understand the question of what is guilt, what is shame, and to differentiate those two. So guilt proneness is feeling bad about your behavior when you've done something wrong or anticipating that you would feel bad. Shame proneness is feeling bad about yourself. When you do something wrong, you may feel bad about both what you did as well as who you are. But shame is not as helpful as guilt, because when you think, oh, I'm a terrible person, it's much harder to change who you are, right? And that can not necessarily lead to as many repair-oriented actions. Okay, so with that in mind, once I have had a better sense of what guilt proneness and shame proneness are, people's responses to the guilt proneness questionnaire predicted whether they were more likely to lie to their peers in negotiation role-play exercises, for example, several weeks later. So that was really intriguing, because just asking people a few, 4 or 5 questions, and then it could predict with some degree of accuracy who was likely to lie and to their classmates. I thought that was fascinating, right? Because it was capturing something about that would relate to their ethical behavior. And so that was about 10 years ago now. I had those initial findings back in 2011. And at that time, and then in the many years since, I've become interested. What are all the different other things that guilt proneness might predict? Things like trustworthiness, which we've looked at in laboratory studies, online experiments. So say you send me an amount of money, $10, and then it triples to $30. And I have the choice, do I send any of that back to you to share with you, or just keep all the money? Turns out people who are low in guilt proneness, they're more likely to keep all the money. People who are higher in guilt proneness, they're going to share it back with the person who entrusted them with it. So we've looked at things like trustworthiness, and we find that that's motivated by this sense of responsibility, right? You trusted me, and now I have this responsibility and accountability to act in a trustworthy way. And also what we can think of in a way is the opposite, the helpful behaviors in the workplace, what we call organizational citizenship. Right? Taking time to advise others, mentor others, rearranging your shifts, vacation schedules. People who are higher in guilt proneness, they feel this sense of responsibility to others, and that can motivate both more positive behaviors and be less likely for them to do negative behaviors. And then finally, one other set of findings that was initially identified by Professor Rebecca Schomburg at the University of Pennsylvania and Professor Frank Flynn at Stanford University is the relationship between guilt proneness and leadership potential, which I've subsequently replicated in my own work, that people who are high in guilt proneness are more likely to be judged as effective leaders by their peers or by people who report to them or supervisors. And this has been looked at in a few different ways, with the idea that if a person's high in guilt proneness, they have more of this sense of responsibility to others. And having that sense of responsibility to others makes a person more effective leader.
So I want to go to kind of a practical conversation, which is, putting myself in the shoes of somebody who's running a bank and wanting to build and hire a highly guilt-prone, well-practiced, aware staff that is not framing things as games, but rather kind of living their own moral compass when at work. It sounds to me like those are the elements that, from your perspective, that I would really want to make sure to kind of imbue.
We need to hire people with high levels of moral character, but we also need to create organizational cultures that is going to bring out the best in people in the workforce. And so I often think of personality, character like a habit. Once something becomes a habit, it can become hard to change. Right? And so if you think of from the hiring perspective, if you're hiring people who already have established ways of behavior, whether that's something about who they are or what they learned at, say, a prior organization that maybe had a negative culture or some other prior experiences, if you hire people who kind of bring that with them, it can be hard, to change that habit. Organizations can start by hiring people that have the character traits that they think are important. But those, might be hard to judge. Some things may only come out in certain situations, in high pressure situations, you might not realize that. And that's not to say, even if you hire good people, there can still be environments and culture that doesn't allow them to be their best selves. And so that's where what is the organizational culture? What are the policies? How are decisions framed? Are they framed very narrowly about, short-term focus, or are they framed a little more broadly, or are the relevant stakeholders highlighted, or is it a more narrow focus on one particular set of people? But even the most moral people can have blind spots, could have situations that would hinder them from having, say, a lot of moral recognition, moral awareness, or even if they even if they recognize the moral issue, there could be cultures that they don't feel safe speaking up to voice those values. And so you need both the culture and character.
So how do you hire for moral character?
We've come up with 2 questions, interview questions that can help. With hiring, first, you have to identify what do you want to look for? What's important? So 3 questions, I think, kind of capture the essence of this. Would this person feel guilty about committing a transgression, making a mistake, even if no one knew about what they did? That captures what guiltproneness is. Would they feel bad about letting others down or harming them, even if it was not done intentionally? Does the person have a strong sense of responsibility for others? So one question, we call it the difficult dilemma question. We ask people to describe an experience in which they were faced with a difficult dilemma at their job, a situation where they found it hard to decide what to do. We ask them what factors did they consider, what did they do, what, if anything, did they learn from the experience. The idea here is that people who have higher levels of moral character are more likely to mention some kind of consideration of others, maybe consideration of long-term consequences. They would have more maybe moral awareness of the implications of their decisions. When you ask people to describe a difficult dilemma and what they were thinking about, is the response indicating that they're focused narrowly on themselves, or very short-term focus, or is it thinking more broadly? And so that question is interesting because it seems like it provides information that people can make a judgment, sort of a holistic judgment of whether they think the person is relatively high or low moral character from reading responses to that question. And then we have a second question we've devised that also seems to provide helpful information. We call it the mistake question. Please tell us about a time when you made a mistake at work. How did you feel when this occurred? What did you do? What, if anything, did you learn from the experience? And here the idea is, when people make a mistake, do they feel bad about it? Does it motivate them to correct their behavior, do something different in the future? And how people talk about mistakes they've made in the past can provide some information about their character. We found that people can sort of read responses to these questions, make accurate predictions about how a person's likely to behave, how much workplace deviance they would do at their jobs, decisions in different economic games. What's not yet clear, what I think we still need to learn, is what exactly are the judges, the people reading the responses, what are they cueing into that allows them to make accurate judgments? Because I think it's more of an intuitive, people just get an impression from those questions, the information revealed by them. And it turns out those impressions have some level of accuracy. But of course, not 100%, because why would we think an answer to one question would be 100% predictive? The fact that it provides any predictive, useful information, I find fascinating.
It's interesting that people have an impression, even though I believe you said that they're reading written responses versus reading someone's body language or, some other kind of in-person way that you have intuition about somebody.
So the way we've done this work is with written responses. We haven't yet tested this in face-to-face or online or even phone calls. There's earlier work on lie detection that suggests sometimes providing people with more information leads people to focus on the wrong things. And I think there's early work by Dr. Paul Ekman that found people were better at detecting lies over the phone than videos, for example, because people focused on the wrong things. It's interesting to test, and we haven't compared how people do with these sorts of questions, written versus verbal, audio, visual. But I think there is some reason for us to think that reading sort of written responses could be just as revealing, if not more revealing, because when it is face-to-face, people may tune into the wrong things by assuming, say, a person's more attractive, then they must be more ethical, right? Or the way in which a person communicates, their tone, their vocal cues. That information may not be diagnostic at all, yet people could use it to form an inaccurate judgment.
Now that we've, hired people with high moral character using your interview questions, they've come into the context of whatever our culture is. And so what do I do to make sure that I'm creating an environment in which people are able to, have high levels of moral awareness, recognize moral situations, and kind of avoid a game mindset.
One of the findings from my work is that people assume having honest conversations with colleagues, friends, with all sorts of people is going to be much worse than it actually is. So people withhold information, they stay silent. So the research on things like psychological safety or voice and silence in the workplace that is focused on how do you create a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up, where they feel safe to speak up. I think that has implications for honesty and conversation about ethics. And I mentioned that idea of giving voice to values. And so making it clear that people can disagree, creating an environment, from the leadership in the organization, from the policies in the organization that allow for disagreement, that allow people to raise concerns without fear of retribution or feel, that they'll be humiliated. When you think of an ethical decision-making, we can think of what are the factors the organization can do to bring out more awareness, framing the goals. So goal setting, there's some work talking about goals gone wild, which is a great title of a paper, with the idea that when an organization has goals that are too extreme, and then people feel like they have to meet them, then they can lose sight of a lot of other things, right? It makes it more of this competitive environment. People might feel like they have to cross ethical boundaries to reach those goals. And I think it also reduces moral awareness too, because people are so focused on achieving that goal. It can lead to that game mindset, that game framing. Thinking, what are the appropriate goals the organization can set? If you want a culture that promotes teamwork, how are people being incentivized? Is it based on their individual performance, and where it creates an environment where people feel like they may need to behave, in ways that could harm their colleagues to get there? So thinking about what are the incentives, how are the rewards set in the organization? All of that can be helpful, I think, for creating an ethical culture.
So I'm so curious as I listen to you talk about all of this, and as I listen to you talk about moral awareness and the importance of practice also and moral recognition, how has your work influenced your own behavior and your own awareness of your moral character and your moral behavior?
I mean, certainly I probably think about guilt and shame more than most people, right? And honesty. Actually, most recently, the work I've been doing is on honesty. And so I've been very cognizant of situations where me and people I'm around could be more or less honest. I have 2 young children. And so being really mindful with my conversations with them, asking a question, because sometimes the easier answer is not to be fully honest, or thinking, how do you be honest in an age appropriate way? So I've been sort of very mindful of that. And also with guilt and shame, so when I think of my own personal life and raising children, to the questions earlier about how do we develop this, if a person does something wrong and they feel bad about their behavior, that's very different than feeling bad about themselves, right? That's the difference between guilt and shame, right? So you made a mistake here, but it doesn't mean you're a bad person, right? And so I think about that, as I'm sure many parents do, of how do we frame the messages to our children? How do we, fighting with a spouse or a friend, I think it can be easy to say, you're this or you're that, right? And that would be a very more global way of saying it, to put negative labels on people, as opposed to, here's this negative thing that you did or I did. And to think specifically about behavior, which would be more about guilt, as opposed to more globally about a negative attribution about yourself or another person's self.
I was thinking about my daughter as well when you were talking about shame versus guilt, and how do you create guilt proneness and not shame?
Yeah, I think it's a great question with parenting. It comes up a lot. Right? And I think the key thing that I take away from the research that I keep in mind is it's really hard to change yourself as a whole person. It can feel overwhelming, right? It can make people want to hide. It can make them angry if they feel like they are flawed in some way. That sense of shame is a really negative thing to feel, and it's hard to know what to do with that. It's painful when you know you've made a mistake or done something wrong, and maybe you can't fix it. And I think it's critically important when we think about children, and also some managers giving feedback, right? I mean, so think of what are the workplace implications, or when there's times at work when we have to give negative feedback to others, best practices there. Can you give feedback about specific behaviors and what could be done differently? right? As opposed to, well, a more global negative evaluation of the person or something that the person doesn't really understand how they could behave differently. So that difference between a behavior versus a person's whole self, I think, is one of the things that sticks with me. And I'm not sure how it influences my day to day, but I'm sure it does.
Can honesty be induced through kind of good examples and sharing positive examples?
It's a fundamental truth in psychology that we look to others to try and figure out the appropriate ways to behave. We do this sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. So the examples that are around us, I think especially of people who are at very visible positions, leaders in organizations, how they behave sort of sets a tone, sets a message, and people look to that. So if you have high profile people who are very visible in their organization, very influential, power, status, if they are perceived by others as being more honest, as more ethical in whatever way, I think that can set an example because it lets people know what the expected behaviors are, what the organization values. So I do think having what we can think of as moral beacons in the organization can help influence the culture in a positive way.
Taya, thank you so much. This has been fascinating and really fun.
Sure.
For more conversations like this, as well as publications and other resources related to banking culture reform, please visit our website at newyorkfed.org/governance and culture reform.